thank you to all of our participants for being here today. Um, I'm immensely grateful to all of you for making this happen, and in particular you, Francis, obviously. So yeah, my gratitude to that. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Freddie. I'm a founder of the Decameron Project. This is Alex. He's also a key part of the project. And obviously, I think all of you guys know that the subject of this conversation today is with you, Francis. So just a bit of context on Francis and her career. Francis had a very long and very successful career in journalism prior to delving into the world of writing. She was a former travel and culture editor for CNN, and she's grown up in this international environment between the United States and South Korea, where she has many roots. She graduated Dartmouth. She's taught and lectured at Columbia, among other prestigious institutions. She's written for some phenomenal places, among them The Atlantic and The Believer. And most recently, she's just come out with her first book back in April. It's called If I Had Your Face. I highly, highly recommend it to anyone on this Zoom. Yep, she's got it right there. So I highly recommend it to anyone on this Zoom who hasn't got the chance to check it out. But yeah, so very exciting. Thank you for being with us today, Francis.
I mean, I'm so happy to be here and thank you for hosting.
Not at all, not at all. So I guess then we should dive right into it. And I think probably a question, just from that very brief introduction that many of our audience will have, I'd love it if you could give us, just to contextualize the conversation a bit, just to give us, a bit of an idea roughly for those who aren't so aware in our audience, just to give us a bit of an idea of your book and what it's about.
Yes, so my book is a novel. I originally thought of it as a group of interconnected short stories, but my agent called it a novel. And I remembered that the Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. Amy Tan also thought of her book as an interconnected group of short stories, but that was also called a novel. But it's a novel, and it's set in contemporary Korea, and it follows 4 young women narrators who are navigating a life for themselves. They were not born into wealth and status. Several of them are orphans from a province in Korea, and they've all moved to Seoul before the beginning of the novel, and they're struggling to kind of carve out a life for themselves. And Korea right now has such a unique set of global superlatives for such a small country. And that was something that I covered, as an editor for CNN. I would constantly be interviewing and covering topics that I found very fascinating, even though I had grown up in Korea. And I kind of developed an arsenal of facts that I stored away to use in my fiction one day, because writing fiction was always my dream ever since long before high school, actually. And so the contemporary Korean landscape is something you don't see a lot. Actually, it's hard to think of another novel that is set in contemporary Korea, because many of the few that are out there, they're usually historical, or there are translations, but that's an entirely different thing. And it was always an ambition of mine to tackle Korea and the different kind of superlatives that it has, including, just to introduce it, it's the world's most wired country. So high-speed internet proliferates the entire country.
Oh, absolutely.
As just random facts rolling off the top of my head: the world's highest smartphone penetration. It has a lot. It's the world's most educated country, because there is a high emphasis on education, and a lot of people go into household debt to educate their children. So you have some funny comments.
Don't worry, only we can see them.
Okay.
Do continue. So sorry about that, Francis.
No worries.
So yeah, it was fascinating what you were talking about there, and there's so much that I'd really love to pick into there. But obviously, yeah, you were talking about Korea a lot, and I thought that, especially from what I've read of your book and of the reviews that I've read on it, um, there were just it was so interesting how you decided to tell that story from four different perspectives, and especially from the perspectives of ultimately not only women but Korean women, and it's ultimately a perspective that is pretty unique as far as literature goes. Um, and so what I wanted to ask you then was, especially in light of, you know, what we're celebrating at the end of the day with this event, which is Asian American Heritage Month, and obviously with the thought of, you know, the pandemic of hate that's also sweeping this country against Asian Americans in wake of the spread of the virus. I'd love it if you could, you know, delve a bit deeper into the importance that you place on telling stories from those perspectives, which are perspectives that perhaps aren't so familiar to most of your United States audience.
Yes, I think fiction and nonfiction equally are important in terms of experiencing other cultures and experiencing empathy for people who are not like yourself. And as we've seen in the wake of the coronavirus, as you guys have started this as a reaction to that, I think it's important to encounter as many cultures as you can and to gain an understanding of other perspectives through that. And, in that way, I think diversity is so important to read and so important to kind of spread different perspectives. And that's why it's very important to me to write about South Korea, especially since it's not covered very much in American fiction. And which is why I was very ambitious in terms of addressing
I gotta
Yeah.
say, just
the topic.
from a writing perspective, do you ever struggle with conveying a culture to your audience they might not be so familiar with? How do you, get them to really invest in the story if they might not be so familiar with the circumstances that it takes place? Surely that takes a bit of
Yeah,
skill and
for
work. No?
sure. That's a really good question, and something that I thought about, every day that I was writing, because um, I want to contextualize everything, but not kind of hammer people over the head with explanations. For people who are coming to the book with no prior knowledge of Korean culture and the current landscape, but also for people who are intimately aware of Korean culture as well. So I wanted it to be equally interesting and have takeaways for an array of people. And that's where my training as a CNN editor really helped me, because every day when I was writing for CNN, I would contextualize different stories and kind of explain the backgrounds of how an extreme story came to be for an international audience. And I would always have to assume that the reader has no prior working knowledge of the culture and the people and the landscape. And that helped me kind of contextualize it. And it's something that I really spent a lot of time over.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you touched on something really interesting there, which I think I definitely believe would be fascinating to many members of our audience. I know that your career as a journalist is something of real interest to me, because I'm thinking of perhaps going into that realm, and likewise to many members of our audience. So I was just wondering, I know you've addressed quite a lot of it there, but I was wondering how exactly, you know, your career as a journalist, particularly for CNN, and being so exposed and so amidst all of that culture, and having to convey that to a Western audience at the end of the day. I was wondering if you think how profoundly you think that shaped, you know, your path as a novelist, and yeah, I think that would be really fascinating if you could shed some light on that for us.
Yeah, for me, journalism and fiction has always kind of gone hand in hand ever since my high school days, when I think I was the arts editor of our newspaper, and I was active in the literary journal, and that continued in college and grad school. But I think they really feed each other, because journalism, you learn how to write very tightly and you kind of pack in a lot of facts, but you also have to be because digital, for example, I was writing for .com, so you have to keep the reader's attention, and we have instant feedback over when a reader stops reading, like what sentence the reader stops reading. So that kind of feedback was really, really interesting for me in terms of, oh, this is how you keep someone's attention, and this is how you have to, like, you know, infuse style into your writing as well. But it, of course, has to be packed with facts. And the flip side, I think my fiction definitely benefits from journalism in the sense that it allowed me to build up that arsenal of facts that I was telling you about and
Yeah.
kind of refer to those, but in a contextualized, like nuanced way, um, that, you know, with the freedom of writing more for myself and what I wanted to convey rather than for the audience that's being like, you know, in the millions as I look at it on the tracker or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, so but in terms of journalism, also like just covering an array of topics, it gave me a wealth of material, and interviewing people, you really learn to kind of dig deep into stories and what makes people interesting. So that was also very helpful.
I gotta say, Francis, in doing some, reading about how you actually came up with the research for this book, I found some, super interesting stuff about how you went in to talk to plastic surgeons, as I understand it, in Korea and all this. I was wondering, do you reckon your experience as a journalist, shaped the way you research topics in depth for your writing to further develop them?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of the research happened during CNN as well. Even it was for stories that I wasn't, you know, it was for stories for CNN at the time, and then I would go further in my fiction and kind of take off where I wanted to continue the story, and that CNN article had kind of ended in a certain place, and I wanted to go beyond that. But it's definitely given me the tools to interview people. And for the contemporary art part, there's a narrator in my book who's an artist, and she, you know, that's in another whole other world that I'm very fascinated by, the contemporary art in Korea. And so I would interview routinely artists who would very kindly volunteer their time for an interview. And it's quite amazing. I've discovered how people are kind and generous with their time to teach you about what they do and how they spend their days and all the nitty-gritty things that I have to ask as a
Interesting.
fiction writer.
So I was wondering then, so thank you for shedding light on that, especially, on the journalism angle. It's very interesting that you see writing and journalism so connected. And to be fair, I do agree with you. So I was just wondering then, obviously one aspect I'm sure of journalism is this whole commercial aspect to it. And I'm sure as a part of that, and I think you'll appreciate this as a writer as well, is that and I know that I personally struggle with this, and I know that probably likewise many on our, especially the students and the high school educators on our call will relate to it as well, is that at the end of the day, while we want to write what we'd like and we'd like to produce something profound, there are also other factors that come in. For example, deadlines, for example, having to write to an audience or having to write to what's expected of you. So I was wondering then, especially in connection with your career as a journalist, how those two might look different, but also if you could speak to, as a writer, how you manage those kinds of things, especially, deadlines and writing to an audience, because I think that's of particular importance, especially at the age that a lot of our viewers are at.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious how this experience of going through publication will impact the writing of my next book, which
Yeah, I was also
I'm in
fascinated.
the middle of right now. And obviously, due to the pandemic, I have two little children running around screaming. So that's been on hold. And so it's, in the beginning, when I was attempting fiction and I went to an MFA program for fiction, and I didn't really know what I was doing or what stories I wanted to tell. And it was after I had returned to Korea, I took a leave of absence and I returned to Korea and kind of had all these experiences of working there, of going through personal loss in my life, of growing kind of as a person and in a professional sense. And then I just realized that maybe I should just try to write about something very granular to my own life, and something that the director of Parasite, Bong Joon-ho, has said in interviews, and including at the Oscars, that really, really like resounds, it reverberates in me, is that the most personal is the most creative. And I think he was quoting Scorsese.
Yeah.
I find that that's really true. And I would write all these stories kind of from, for a while, I was writing them from a white perspective because I had grown up reading protagonists who are white in American fiction. Of course, I was reading Korean protagonists in Korean fiction, but when I was writing in English, I would just automatically start writing white protagonists because that's what I had read growing up. And so when I turned to the most personal, and I started with Ada, who's this mute stylist who's obsessed with K-pop, and she is in her whole own little world. And that was something that I had never seen before in English fiction. And, you know, it's such a wealth of material because it's so personal to me. And I know like how all the nitty gritty crazy things work in that fandom world. And it was fun to write about. And so I think in trying not to think of the audience and trying to go to what bothers you the most, that's something that I always talk about when I'm teaching creative writing. Like, think about what bothers you the most in your personal life and try to start from there. Yeah.
Wow, Francis, that was a super reply. I've got to admit, I've never thought of writing like that ever, but to think of just some of my favorite books, it makes complete sense. I guess the question is, once you have this, call it a core value of a book you're working on, or something that you really want to express, what's your process for developing that and fleshing it out into a fully fledged novel, or even taking this idea that let's say after you found it, you're really committed to it, and taking that and transitioning that and actually writing it out into something full with characters and plot and all those important things?
Wow. You know, I was watching this virtual event between John Grisham and Stephen King, which was fascinating, by the way, because their working styles are so different. John Grisham plots out every chapter and has like a monthly deadline for what he does. And Stephen King was saying he doesn't know what he's writing next week, but he ends the day knowing what he's writing tomorrow. And I'm definitely more of the Stephen King category, but I'm trying to go into the John Grisham category for my next book, and trying to plot more. And what's interesting is I think first-time novels tend to be in the Stephen King category because we really don't know what we're doing as first-time novelists. And then with the second books, I've seen a lot of interviews where the writers try to plot more in advance. So I don't know how successful they are in terms of actually making it happen. But for this book, because I conceived it as an interconnected group of short stories, I tried to contain, a story arc within each story.
Yeah.
But they all live in the same apartment building, all these girls. And so they kind of flit in and out of each other's lives. And that was one way of, it's kind of like a TV series where you have a longer story arc throughout the series, but you have like Law and Order, like an episodic thing, a smaller story arc and then a longer story arc. So I would have the other characters kind of pull through the longer story arc, and at the granular like chapter level, I would try to contain one immediate story arc. And that's
makes sense. Well, there's a lot in there, and I actually loved how, and I'd love to talk perhaps in a bit, or even we can save it till the Q&A to talk about kind of your expression of the granular, because I think that perhaps that's a key part of the book, and a key part that I love. But meanwhile, I think a lot that you mentioned there is actually a really nice pivot into something else we are very keen to talk about, which is essentially you were talking about, acknowledging the fact this is your first book, and that means that things are different. And especially for a lot of our audience, and in particular high schoolers on here, you're perhaps not massively far off from where they hope to be in 10 years from now. So I was just wondering then, what kind of steps and what challenges you had to face and how you overcome them in terms of breaking into that world, into that writing world? Because doing something, indeed anything, for the first time obviously is going to be daunting and challenging.
Yes, and
Sorry,
it's
it's very broad.
a career that I do not necessarily recommend. In fact, I highly do not recommend this for all of its emotional ups and downs, which is seriously daily roller coaster of emotions and crazy
I think a
things.
lot of the high schoolers here, you know, just sorry to interrupt, but like I agree that a lot of the high schoolers here are trying to tell stories. I think we're all acquainted with, you know, that it is a roller coaster. I can imagine it's just tenfold for a novel. But anyway,
Yeah. So just to give you some context, it took me 10 years from the first words on the page to publication.
Wow.
And that was a very dark 10 years because I was writing in the dark with no feedback. No one had asked for this book. It was just, you know, for fiction, you have to have a completed manuscript before you submit it to agents. And that's just the first part of the process. So, you know, when the first day of my MFA class, the professor kind of sat us down and told us 95% of you will never publish a book. And we all go, oh, what? Why are we paying, you know, this much money for an expensive graduate education then? And then he continued, because 95% of you will never finish a book. So it's all up to you to finish the book. And I have to say, finishing the book, because starting a book is very easy.
Sure.
I think there are a lot of, you know, first few chapters of novels sitting in everyone's desk. And it's really the key, you know, finishing, like following through and doggedly working on something when no one is asking for it and no one cares at all except for you. That's the hard part. Especially when, you know, you have to get a job to like get on with your life as well. And you know, in my case, I had children right after I quit CNN, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to work on this book full time. And then by then I was pregnant and, you know, my life was over. So I think for me personally, desperation to finish was something, the key factor. And I saw the key motivation. And because I wasn't working at the time, I had left CNN before I had children. And so to me, I needed to make this work, or else I would have, you know, have wasted these 10 years of my life, and I couldn't bear that. And that desperation really propelled me forward. But at, you know, your idea of what a finished manuscript is might be very different from an agent's idea. So I would say that, you know, you don't, because there's no end of work that you could do on a manuscript. It will go on forever. So if I could do it over again, I would maybe go back like 5 years and see if I would go out with what I had then. Because what ended up happening was my editor had a lot of very amazing suggestions, and I ended up writing a few more chapters under her direction. And that's not something I could have done on my own without the guidance and her wisdom and her experience of reading and working for, you know, decades in the business.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Wow.
No, sorry, I just wanted to say that just so much of what you were talking about there, you know, especially talking about the importance of finishing and getting to the end, I think also harkens back to the contrast, which is ultimately the very beginning. And you were talking about going back in time there. That's an interesting thing, because I was just wondering, going back to the very beginning, before you even put those first words on the page, back even to high school, to the ages, you know, where a lot of the people on this Zoom and a lot of our attendees are at, I was wondering if there was anything that you could speak to, perhaps, you know, having gone back in time and being able to speak to that high school self, that fledgling emergent writer. If there's anything that you'd say to her that you think would be of particular value, particularly, you know, towards the mind that, you know, it would also be of immense value to many people on this Zoom.
So what I was doing in high school was I was writing stories and I was publishing the way that, everyone here is doing right now. And that's really great because I look back now and I don't know if you guys will do this later, but I cringe at what I was writing then. And I think that's because I was writing about things that were not actually important to me. And it was about things that I thought should be important to me and what I thought was important to potential readers. And I think that's kind of the difference that came later on with my, this is again a personal timeline. But yeah, at the time, again, I was writing about white protagonists and kind of thinking about things that I had no idea about actually when I think about it. And so again, it would be trying to find the most painful part of your life or the most, thing that you really can't bear. Um, and I'm sure there are many trials and tribulations that you are going through. And starting from there would be my advice. But again, also at the same time, I would just write as much as possible because with every page you get better. And the more that you write, and that's something that I try to do now, any form of writing helps. And there isn't a single day that goes by where I'm not writing, whether it's, diary entries or really long emails to friends or, just totally random. I'm trying to write a children's picture book. Again, procrastinating with my second novel, which is actually due, and other things like that. So any form of writing really jogs you along and greases the wheels. So that's very important.
Uh, Thanks for that, Francis. I got to say, just before, I'm mindful that we have to turn questions towards our audience in a minute. But just something, I guess, a bit of a personal question, because I myself, I've enjoyed writing, I guess, really short, almost essays. And one of the big things that I struggle with in terms of how do I take my writing and start producing something, more long lasting and a bit lengthier is the issue of character development. Because it's one thing to be able to introduce a character and, almost stereotype them into something that everyone can relate to. But it's another thing entirely to really build one and have it be a dynamic, developing thing. And so I was wondering, just to seek wisdom from the sage who's actually, written and completed a novel, what your process is for developing characters and really building them into, real people just in pages.
Yeah, well, I was with my characters for 10 years, so I really feel like I know them better than my husband, who I've only been married to for 6 years. So, but in the beginning, I just don't write about them for a long time. I just think about them for a long time, and I try to, write down. When I do write things down, I would write down when, where they were born, what their birthdays are, what they like really some kind of profile. And then I would go into just thinking about them. And I'm thinking about my character now for my second book. And there are things, I'm not necessarily thinking in terms of building a character. It's more like just getting to know someone, getting to know a stranger. And so I'm asking her questions in my mind. What were your deepest fears when you were a child? What were your parents like? What were your grandparents like? I think starting from your parents, the character's parents and the character's grandparents is actually very important. I love when I meet new people, and I'm a very one-on-one type person. I love like sitting them down and asking them all these questions about their life. And my most favorite question is asking them about their parents. And I think that's where the most pain is packed and the most, love. And because when love is mixed with pain, you get an explosion of conflict. So that's where I really start. So I would advise that.
I gotta say, just thanks. I mean, just such a profound answer. I don't even know how to respond other than that. Just, I'm just shocked and so happy to. I mean, there's absolutely truth in what you say completely. That even traits as well as internal conflict, people I suppose in some degree get passed down by their parents. But I'm mindful, of course, that we've got 35 extra people waiting to ask you some questions. And
Yeah,
so I think with that, Francis, if you don't mind, now I'll turn over questions to the floor.
absolutely.
So
Yeah, absolutely. If you
thank you so
guys
much.
want to, yeah, I was just about to say, if you guys in the audience wanted to type a question, you can use a thing called the Q&A function. It should be a little button down there. We can see your questions. I don't know if you can see them, but basically we'll click a button and then we can essentially pass it over to Francis to get answered. So I think the first one here, I was asked a while back, so I do apologize. I don't, perhaps it's Richard I'm referring to, a teacher in Colorado. Um,
Hi.
perhaps Richard, you jumped on a little after we said we were going to do Q&A, so I think it's worth addressing your question first. So Richard's question was, hello all, I'm Richard, a teacher in Colorado, and I'd love to know whether you struggle to familiarize your wide international audience with Korean culture.
Yeah. I there were definitely many conscious decisions that I made thinking of an international audience. But again, I was trying to reconcile the reader who doesn't know about Korean culture to my friends, for example, who all grew up in a similar environment that I did, a very international one. And so I tried to write for myself and and that's like, yeah, again, I didn't over explain. And what I tried to do is contextualize. So if I'm talking about, for example, a Korean dish or a Korean phrase, and I try to put it into the context without actually defining what it means. And then what was very useful to me at the time was workshop. I had a weekly workshop with two women who had never been to Asia, and they were not Asian. And so when I workshop my stories with them, I would be like, can you understand what this word means, even though I didn't say what it means? And they said, oh, doesn't 상견례 mean, when two families come together to meet, to arrange a marriage? I was like, yeah, that's exactly what it means. So then, that kind of bouncing the idea and getting feedback off of those chapters were very informative. So I would try that if you're writing something on your
Yeah.
own.
I guess I'll just shuffle it on to the next one. Rose, who's actually my sister, I'm not sure if she can see me right now. She asks if you were ever scared to commit to being a writer, and what general advice you give to someone who knows that they
Again,
really have.
do not recommend being a writer.
You don't recommend.
But it is at the same time like one of the most wildly emotional experiences I've ever gone through, but at the same time the most incredibly fulfilling. So I have to say it's a double-edged sword. It's like having children too. Oh my God. The highs are highs and the lows are low. I definitely did not think that I would make it many times as a writer. So what my mom taught me was kind of to hold, and I dedicated this book to her and saying, thank you for teaching me how to hold on to a dream. So she was completely supportive of becoming a writer, but at the same time, she was like, you have to get a job that will help your writing. And, at the same time, have you build a career as well. So in that sense, I am very indebted to her for letting me hold on to the dream that way, and trying to figure out, the day job situation is something that writers all struggle with, and I know, every writer has some crazy day job. Unless you're in an airport bookstore with your own entire bookshelf, you definitely probably have a day job. And the different kind of, what was interesting was when I went to Columbia for MFA, my professor told me the best day job for a writer is a waitress, and you should really be a waitress. And I was like, oh, how come? And she had been a waitress for 15 years before she became an award-winning writer professor. And she was saying that for her, she needed to have her mind clear while she wrote. So her job needed to be on her feet. So, you're doing like physical mobility actions. And again, like Anne Patchett, who's who's one of my favorite writers, she was also a waitress before she became a writer. And she says the same thing in her memoirs. And, you know, it's different for everybody, but that really worked for her. So trying to find the puzzle piece day job that will allow you to write. For me, it was journalism. And for these writers, it was being a waitress.
Fair enough.
So that is key. Survival while you dream.
Great question right now from Shelley. If you're in the audience, you can hear this is a question being answered. Shelley's written, you spoke about how when you were young, you did not write about topics that were true to you. What advice do you have to young writers that could help them find what is true to them and thus create work that is truly valuable? That's a phenomenal question, Shelley.
I think, again, trying to start from family. So one exercise that I have my students do is write about a family conflict. And I'm sure every family has a conflict. I've never actually met a family who doesn't have some kind of conflict in the generations past.
Right.
And I think if it's family, you have a better sense because you know both sides on some level, and you can empathize with both sides. It's a really interesting exercise in kind of rounding out a conflict and as well as character development. So again, trying to find something very painful and near to you, and at the same time, like something that can propel a story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about pain so frequently. I know that I've, especially for the Decameron Project, which is at its core about storytelling and about telling stories of value, especially during COVID-19. I know I've read and reviewed a bunch of stories, and some of the most profound have evidently tapped into that kind of pain and something very personal. So yeah, I certainly concur with your answer. So that's a wonderful question, Shirley. Thank you. So our next question that we're going to answer is an anonymous attendee has asked, hi, what aspect of writing do you struggle most with? Plot, dialogue, characters, motivational backstory?
Oh my gosh. All of
Tough ones coming your way.
all of the above. I struggle with endings. That's definitely the biggest, as I've talked about before. But yeah, plot. I think I'm more of an internal writer. So I love backstory, I love character, and I love conflict. But conflict resolution is hard for me.
Yeah.
And therefore
As it is in real life, I imagine. I think we only have time for about one more question. I'm sorry to all of you who didn't quite manage to get them out there. They're flooding in now. But this one kind of touches specifically on dialogue. And again, an anonymous attendee writes, this is a general question, but I was wondering if you had any advice on dialogue. I feel like, especially as a high school writer, it's difficult to write dialogue that feels real. Any particular words of advice there, or?
I mean, honestly, I think the best practice is by reading a lot. So just reading and reading, and at the end, I definitely find myself stopping when I read bad dialogue. But when I read good dialogue, it never, it crosses my mind that I'm reading dialogue. It just unfolds in my head like a movie. And so, honestly, the best advice I could give any writers to read a ton. I think reading is more important than writing at this point. And even now I try to read several books a week, which has been hard, but I just finished Rodham yesterday, which was amazing, absolutely amazing. I highly recommend. But when I write, I have about 10 books that are on rotation that I carry with me all the time. And depending on what I'm stuck on, I pull out the one that I use as kind of like a spiritual guide. And so for if it's something like setting or searing sentences, I pull out Elizabeth Strout. If it's vocabulary and creating like this dark ambiance, I pull out Margaret Atwood. If it's getting a multitude of POVs, very diverse, voices and carrying authenticity in each, I pull out Charles Baxter. So, you know, and or Amy Tan.
Yeah.
And if it's like setting in a non-Western environment, I pull out like Ha Jin or Ian Lee. So again, like I look to like what really the books that really touched me, and I use them as a guide through that process.
Fair enough. Well, we're actually, you know, I feel awful to truncate all these questions. So I think we're going to go for 2 more questions, actually, just to get some, because there are some really good ones I could bear not to read out.
An interview soon, but yes.
No, absolutely. There's just been some real good thought put into particularly this one I'm about to read out. So I think it's definitely worth you answering. But I am conscious of your time, Francis, so we won't keep you for too much longer.
Yeah.
So this is a question from Artemis. She said, you discussed that an author must stay committed to their novel in order for there to even be a possibility that it is published. How many novels have you abandoned? And what about this story particularly motivated you to finish it, even over the course of a lengthy 10 years? So that's an excellent question, I think. I'm fascinated to know the answer as well.
So I would say the first 4 years I spent on one character who was submitted along with this novel. She was a 5th narrator that ended up being cut entirely by my editor. I mean, she suggested that I cut it. She never, you know, has an ultimatum, and I completely agreed with what she was doing. So the premise was that I would use that character and develop that into my second book. That's not happening anymore because I just can't deal with that. So I would say that's kind of an abandoned novel. And that was a character that I had thought about all through grad school before that. So a good, I don't know, 7 years spent thinking about her.
Wow.
But I think that, you know, it's nothing, I don't feel too badly about it because writing through her, I gained a lot from it. It's not like it was a complete waste. And in fact, it's probably a very necessary exercise to get to the next creation.
It's exactly what you were talking about earlier. Yeah, the whole, you know, every time you bleed onto the page, it's just furthering your own, you know, capacity to do so.
But she was an adoptee based in Boston, and actually, I don't know if I can tell you guys, it's not official in terms of announcement, but we are working on a TV show, and she's in the TV show.
Oh.
So we will see that storyline play out there. But we're not officially announcing until the first day of filming.
Cool.
So it's kind of, you know, she gets her life that way.
Fair enough.
So I guess, I mean, a nice question to round off then is just this final one from Jago, who's in New York. And she asked Francis, I know at a number of points you mentioned in having a new book in the works. Jago, I'm not sure exactly if that's a male or female name. They ask if you have another book in the works and if you could tell us anything about it that isn't too.
Yeah, so this one is set in Boston, half in Korea. And I pitched it to my editor as literary horror. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Korean horror movies. I suppose Parasite kind of ranks in creepy Korean horror. Koreans like to mix all genres into one movie, but it's based off of a conversation that I overheard my mom having with her brother in Korea last summer, and my uncle is a nuclear scientist and he has a PhD in the field and is the most practical person I know. And so is my mom, and they were discussing this family that they had grown up across the street from, who were, I guess, cursed, with a kind of like a ghost that passed down through the family, and all the servants would come screaming, you know, multiple times a year whenever this person would come up, or this deity, there's a Korean word for it, would show up. And so this was the craziest story I've ever heard, and I had never heard them speaking about it. And my proposal was due the next day, so I just typed it up. I was like, send. And my editor was like, great. That's what's happening now.
Fair enough. Well, Francis, thank you for shedding light on that. And again, a massive thank you on behalf of all of our attendees And, you know, particularly on behalf of me, Alex, the Decameron Project at large, to all our attendees, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sitting through and listening to all of the wisdom Francis has had to impart. And, you know, I encourage you guys to go, as ever, submit your story to the Decameron Project. That's what, you know, the name of the game is, so to speak, have your voice heard and the like. But again, Francis, thank you so much for your time. Truly, truly appreciated. And, you know, we've taken a recording of this interview, of this conversation, and it will be posted on our site for all to see as well. So again, Francis, my immense gratitude on behalf of all of us.
It was so much fun. Thank you guys. And I really admire what you're doing, and good luck in all your endeavors.
Thank you, Francis.
Good luck with your TV show and your upcoming
Thank you.
your next book. Hopefully it's just as good as the last.
Thank
I'm gonna end the Zoom now, everyone. So thanks all for attending. Francis, thanks especially to you. And everyone have a good day.
Goodbye all.